Just not missing it.
Damn.
Just to be sure, last time I started introducing the neurological exam stuff, and we did the set generation example. Had somebody calling out words.
Yes.
Okay. So, and I think I probably arranged things that way because I wanted to bring a model in to talk about the spinal cord a little bit. Also to talk about the spinal cord, there's some pictures in the book. The part 1, 2, 3, or 4 assignments on the nervous system are pretty much out of the, anatomy of the nervous system chapter, but following that is the somatic nervous system chapter. And that's actually where I have the information about the spinal cord that I want to include. There we go. It looks like they've updated the website, so it looks different. Anybody notice that?
Yeah, they did that.
Like yesterday?
The things are on the side, yeah. Like, no, yesterday night, because it wasn't like this yesterday morning.
Yeah, I was using this yesterday.
Yeah, I was like,
okay.
what?
So anyways, yes, this is the chapter that those assignments are from, essentially, but also in the somatic nervous system chapter, that's really the function part that goes with the anatomy in this chapter. And a lot of the function I cover in class or in that chapter, but I do get into some things about the nervous system that I want to talk about, about the spinal cord that I want to talk about here. And the first of those is, this will make more sense if I start here. The first of those is about how we control the internet connection on campus apparently today is a little slow. I ran a similar backup slowdowns when I came in first thing this morning. But anyway, the two things about the spinal cord that I want to talk about is really about how the spinal cord is involved in relaying information between the cerebrum and the periphery. The cranial nerves are how the brain communicates with the periphery and the head and neck directly, but for the rest of the body, from the neck down, it has to communicate passing through the spinal cord. And what I'm talking about here, there are sort of two aspects to this, are the descending and ascending pathways. So if you're taking this down in your notes, leave ascending pathways till later because I have a bunch of stuff to put under that. So the figure that I'm showing you here from that somatic nervous system chapter is the pathway that information takes from the cerebrum to the periphery. Okay, so it's descending, it's going down the spinal cord. Now, really, descending doesn't just mean down the spinal cord. It would apply to anything that's from the cortex to lower areas of the nervous system. So even going to the brainstem, that would be a descending pathway. We just aren't going to consider those other descending pathways. That's getting into a bit more detail than I want to deal with right now. The title of this figure, and it's in the text that it comes from up here, is the corticospinal pathway. which tells you where it starts and where it ends. These kinds of names are really about anatomical connections. Now, not all of them, but we will see this kind of construction in another situation. So it's going from the cortex, meaning the cerebral cortex, down to the spine. And really, the pathway is talking about the one neuron that's its cell bodies in the cortex and its synapses in the spinal cord. But we want to think about the functional implications here also. So we're going to include the cell that it's targeting, the cell that it is targeting. So as we look at this picture, there's a bunch of neuron cell bodies just laid out all around the cerebral cortex, and it's labeled saying precentral gyrus, which is specifically the motor cortex, the thing that's telling us to move our bodies. And all of those fibers go down through the white matter of the cerebrum and then through the brainstem. This slice right here shows midbrain. At the midbrain, there are two obvious structures called the cerebral peduncles, which are just white matter tracts that are exposed on the ventral surface. And that's continuous with what we see on the ventral surface of the medulla. In between the midbrain and the medulla, of course, we have the pons, and the pons kind of obscures this structure. The other white matter laying on top of it, we just can't see these fibers, but they're going deep through the pons. Well, not that deep, but underneath the white matter that we see at the pons to continue down. Most of the fibers cross over at the inferior most point in the medulla to cross into a lateral position in the spinal cord, where they continue on down. But there are a handful of fibers that continue down in that same ventral position and then cross over midline right at the last minute. Oh, I didn't. Huh. Oh, there it is. The cell that's up in the, its cell body's up in the cortex and its target is down in the spinal cord. That's called the upper motor neuron, okay, because it's the more superior of the two cells in here. And then its target is called the lower motor neuron. Okay. The drawing here is a little bit imprecise. This black dot represents a cell body, which should be in the gray matter of the ventral spinal cord. And then these two arrows represent the axons that are ending on that. They would not actually end on the exact same target. There should be two cells represented here. And then also, this one looks like it's ending in the white matter. It would really be ending in the gray matter here. So kind of imagine all of this stuff was shifted over a little bit, so it's actually falling in the gray matter. Just a little shortcoming of that picture. And the two pathways don't actually control the same neurons. So those two pathways within the corticospinal tract are referred to as the lateral and anterior corticospinal tract. CST just abbreviates corticospinal tract. So it kind of is one pathway. It has one name, the corticospinal tract. It just separates when we get into the spinal cord into two components based on their location. So the lateral corticospinal tract crosses midline at inferior medulla. And found in lateral white matter, what we call a column, in the spinal cord, SC for spinal cord. And then targets lateral neurons in ventral horn. Okay. Be more consistent. Never noticed this before. Matter horn. Funny. Okay. Just to go back to this picture, and I'll come back to the text if you're trying to get it down. Don't worry. Oops, wrong picture. We see the lateral spinal cord after it crosses over. That crossing over point has a specific name. I'm not going to mention it. It's obviously labeled in this picture. But my lack of saying it out loud is kind of a cue to you that I'm not going to ask you about that particular factoid. It goes down in the lateral white matter, or the lateral column of the spinal cord, and then it targets neurons that are in the more lateral positions of the gray matter. Again, the way this is drawn isn't quite precise. It should be targeting something more over here. And so likewise, we can say the same sorts of things for the anterior corticospinal tract by just changing a few points here. Okay. So the anterior corticospinal tract crosses midline in the spinal cord at the level of synapse. It's found in the anterior white matter or column in the spinal cord, and it targets the medial neurons in the ventral gray matter. So they're kind of just organizing the fibers in a way that we have a bundle that ends up being a lateral position to target lateral neurons in gray matter, and then another one in a more medial or anterior position to target the medial neurons there. Now, when we look at the position of the neurons in that gray matter, it's actually laid out in sort of a map of the human body. Not exactly, not like the map that I described in the motor cortex, but rather the lateral position neurons are going to be responsible for controlling lateral muscles, and the medial position neurons are going to be controlling medial muscles. So what parts of the body are lateral muscles going to tend to control? Yeah, the extremities, arms, legs. And then what are the medial muscles going to control? Going to be not organs. I'm talking about skeletal muscles.
Oh. Pecs and stuff.
Right. So we call that the axial musculature, or the trunk, or the body core, whatever you want to call it. So really, the lateral corticospinal tract could be said to control arms and legs. And the anterior corticospinal tract controls axial or trunk movements. Now, this little division here actually kind of addresses something that might not be terribly obvious, but the lateral corticospinal tract is making a very sort of exaggerated move out to the lateral position, and the stuff controlling the right side of the body is very separate from the stuff controlling the left side of the body. Whereas the anterior corticospinal tract, the two sides, the right and left sides of those, are kind of right next to each other. And there's a little bit of imprecision, maybe we could call it, over what controls what side of the body. And that's okay, because the arms and legs are very separate structures, and they're going to be controlled completely separately. But the axial musculature, you can't really move the right side of your trunk without the left side of the trunk moving also. So the anterior corticospinal tract is a little bit less precise as to the left-right split of what's being controlled, because you're going to control the left and right trunk in a movement like that. So if you're going to, rotate your spine like this, your abdominals that are doing that work are on both sides of the body. Okay. Whereas the lateral corticospinal tract, controlling the arms and legs act basically independent of each other. Now, I say basically independent because we do need to recognize that you need to keep your balance. And so if you're moving your right arm, you're going to be doing something on the left side of your body to counteract that movement. Now, I'm not moving a whole lot, so you can't see that I'm doing a whole bunch, but in my legs, I'm keeping myself a bit more sturdy so that I'm not, as I flail my arm around, I'm not going to fall over. But if I was lifting something really heavy and I swung it with one arm, I'd have to counterbalance myself with the other arm. So they do work together to some degree. Or if you're walking, you can't walk by just moving one leg. You have to move both legs in tandem. So they do interact a little bit, but not as directly as the axial muscles do. But the two pathways, for the most part, do end up crossing midline, so that based on how it's drawn, the side of the brain that's depicted is the left side of the brain, and both pathways end up going to skeletal muscles on the opposite side of the body. It's just the lateral corticospinal tract crosses here. The medial corticospinal tract doesn't cross until the last minute. Now, the other aspect of this idea, the pathways going through the spinal cord, is shown in this other figure, which actually has two parts to it. There are two pathways that I want to talk about here, and they are the ascending pathways. Ascending means going up, so it's how peripheral information goes to the cortex. Okay. I didn't say this with the descending pathways, but what kind of information obviously is traveling through the descending pathways? What's it causing to happen? Right, movement, what we call motor functions. So ascending pathways are going to be carrying what kind of information? Sensory system, yeah. So they're just, it's output and input, so to speak. You may also hear reference to the words afferent and efferent. I don't like to use those words at this point because they're a little bit confusing, but I prefer ascending and descending. But if you hear afferent or efferent or read that, just be aware it's another way of saying this. So of the descending pathways, there are two different ones. There's what's called the dorsal column system. And I want to say 4 things about that. So I want to leave some space for that. And the other one is the spinothalamic tract. And I want to say 4 things about that also. Other sources might use slightly different names for these. I'm kind of reducing it down, simplifying it just to get at the basic ideas here. But I am actually leaving out quite a bit of information. There's a lot of ascending paths. There's a lot of descending paths for that matter. And we're just focusing on the main ones here. So if you find some reference to the dorsal columns and they include something else in the name, that's just being adding a level of information that I'm not adding here. Or there's actually multiple spinothalamic tracts, which in the labeling in the picture I'm about to show you, that's that point's made. But I'm just going to think about that one tract here. So Both of these tracts start with input coming from the dorsal root ganglion and eventually going up to the postcentral gyrus, or the primary somatosensory cortex in the brain, on the left side again. So right side input, left side processing. Right side input, left side processing. Both of these pathways have 3 neurons represented here. And so the 4 things that I'm going to put on the page that I'm writing stuff down are, the first 3 are the specifics of those 3 neurons in either pathway. And then the 4th thing is about what each pathway is responsible for. So we're going to look at how this one goes up along this way, this pathway, and this one goes up along this pathway here. So let me switch over here and just include this information. So the first cell in the dorsal column pathway is a dorsal root ganglion cell. And it's going to head for the medulla. And then the second one, oh, actually, before I go there, let me just do these actually together. In the spinothalamic pathway, we also have a dorsal root ganglion cell, but it's going into the dorsal gray matter, or again, dorsal horn. And then the second neuron in the dorsal column pathway is going from the medulla to, to the thalamus. Now I put a long, line in here for the arrow because I want to make a point, which is this is where we see, whoops, not capital. This is where we see the pathway cross from the right side to the left side in the picture. And this is in the medulla. It crosses over. And then if we go down here and look at the spinothalamic tract, this is going from the spinal cord, the gray matter that I just mentioned, to the thalamus. And in fact, the name spinothalamic tract is referring to this specific neuron. Its axon comes off of the cell body that's in the spinal cord, gray matter, and it travels all the way up to the thalamus. It's the spinothalamic portion of the tract. But we're considering the whole tract here. And I left that X in the arrow here because that's the axon that crosses midline also. And then the third neuron goes from the thalamus to the cortex. And paste that down the bottom, and it's exactly the same. Now, it's not the exact same neuron in both. They're carrying different specific information, but the last leg, the third neuron, is the same basic anatomy there. So let me go over to the picture and just show you this stuff. So looking at the dorsal column system, this first neuron we see, its cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion. The axon's coming from probably the skin, or maybe from muscles or tendons or whatever. It's somatosensory neuron in nature. It enters into the spinal cord and it immediately goes into the gray matter in the dorsal position, what we call the dorsal column. And that's why I'm calling this pathway this dorsal column system. It goes all the way up to the medulla and it synapses on a neuron in a nucleus in the medulla. And then that neuron crosses midline and goes up through the rest of the spinal cord. They have a slice of the midbrain here to depict it. And eventually synapses in the thalamus. And then that thalamic neuron will project up to the postcentral gyrus, which is the somatosensory cortex. Okay. So those are the three neurons there. In the dorsal column, there's a little bit more information here in the picture. In the dorsal column, the white matter is actually split into two regions. There's a lot of different names for bundles of axons and white matter. Fasciculus is just one of those names. But there are two bundles that are in the dorsal column. There's the gracilis and the cuneatus. The gracilis is more medial and the cuneatus is more lateral. We actually don't see the cuneatus until we're in the upper thoracic to cervical spinal cord. Below the, say, T2, T1 level of the spinal cord, the dorsal column is pretty much just the gracilis. This is kind of like an information highway. It's carrying information from the periphery up. The axons pile up in the medial position when the earliest one's getting on, and then they just keep taking up positions more and more lateral to that. By the time we get to the upper thoracic / cervical region, we can make out two separate bundles of fibers there. But essentially, the gracilis represents sensory information coming from the lower body, and the cuneatus is representing sensory information coming from the upper body. The way that in medical school we usually, and when I was taking the medical school course in graduate school, the way that we remembered this was gracilis would be like a graceful dancer. Dancers use their legs, so that's carrying information from the legs. I think that's enough to keep the two straight, but the entire mnemonic, and I really never liked the second half, the cuneatus is in the upper body, and that's closer to your brain, which is cunning. If that helps you, keep it in mind. If not, forget it. I think the graceful gracilis legs thing does the job fine. And in the medulla, the nuclei that they connect to are in fact named the exact same thing. So fibers in the fasciculus gracilis from the lower body go to the nucleus gracilis, and fibers in the fasciculus cuneatus from the upper body go to the nucleus cuneatus. This particular picture is just showing a fiber in one position based actually on the drawing of the cross-section of the spinal cord here. We're looking at the cervical spinal cord. So that would mean this would have to be coming into the cuneatus, and it would synapse on the nucleus too. But that point isn't terribly important for the pathway we're talking about here. Just the idea that the two regions within the dorsal column are carrying information from different regions of the body. But that eventually gets all the way up to there to the top. Now the spinothalamic tract is very similar. The input is still a dorsal root ganglion cell. Its axon is coming from the skin. Its dendrites are in the dermis somewhere. And it enters into the spinal cord, but instead of going into that dorsal column gray matter, it synapses immediately on a neuron in the dorsal gray matter, the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. That's our second neuron. That second neuron then crosses midline and goes up in a lateral position through the spinal cord and the medulla and the midbrain, and it finally synapses in the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, the last neuron goes on to its target. So you'll notice here, because of the way that I showed you the information, the two pictures separately, I didn't point this out so much, but the red colored dorsal root ganglion cell is the first order neuron, which either synapses in the medulla or in the spinal cord. The black colored neuron that crosses midline and goes up to the thalamus is the second order neuron, meaning the second in the pathway. And then is that a purple colored one there? Yeah. Going from the thalamus to the cortex, that's called the third order neuron. because it's the third one in the pathway. Again, that third order neuron, while in the drawing they look like they're the exact same thing, they aren't, because they're carrying different information. Now, the information that they're carrying is actually explained down here on the bottom. So the sensations from the right side of the body in the dorsal column is touch and proprioception, and in the spinothalamic tract is pain and temperature sensations. So that's the fourth thing that I want to write here, is that the dorsal column system carries touch and proprioception information, and the spinothalamic carries pain and temperature. I did say earlier that I'm simplifying things a little bit. I'm only talking about one specific part of the spinothalamic tract. And you'll notice in the picture that we were just looking at that it's actually labeled the lateral corticospinal tract. Other components of the I keep saying corticospinal, spinothalamic tract, sorry. This is the lateral spinothalamic tract. Other components of the spinothalamic tract in other positions carry different information, but these are the ones that I want to concentrate on. Okay. And the reason for that is this is a good place to understand how sensory discrimination can work. So last time I demonstrated sensory discrimination, I used this tensile instead of an actual probe, but it has a sharp end and it has a dull end. And I was showing how you can test sensory discrimination on the face, remember? Mm-hmm. Okay. So we can do the same thing for the rest of the body, and these two ascending pathways actually tell us a little bit of useful information. Now, spinal cord injury is a pretty serious set of things that can happen, but there's a sort of special version of a spinal cord injury that is not the most common type, but it's getting to be more and more common, I think, especially with motorcycle accidents. I don't want to go into why motorcycle accidents are more common for this, but it's called a hemisection. So if we cut all the way through the spinal cord, a complete section of the spinal cord, then we would interrupt all the information from the brain down and from the lower body up. So let's say, as the model here already has it, there's a cut into the spinal cord. So let's say something horrible happened. At this point down, there'd be no motor control. The person would be paraplegic. And from this point up, from this, oops, said that wrong. Also from this point down, there'd be no sensory input. So if somebody can't move their legs, they also won't feel any information, sensory information coming in. However, with a hemisection, that would mean that only half of the spinal cord's damaged. So some sort of trauma to the spinal cord, and it just the mechanics of motorcycle accidents, it's a little bit more exposed. So it's possible for, say, a little piece of bone to break off and go partly through the spinal cord. In a car, you're going to have sort of everything surrounding you, and if you're going to have something serious happen, it's probably going to affect everything. Now, if you have a hemisection, then we can actually find some differences in sensation based on the two ascending pathways. So with the descending pathway, the corticospinal tract that I was talking about earlier, if you have a hemisection, half of the spinal cord, say at this level, is affected, then from that point down, you won't be able to control any muscle movements. In the trunk, from that point down, doesn't really present itself very clearly because there is a little bit of crosstalk on either side. And actually, to separate the right and left anterior corticospinal tracts, you'd have to have a very precise edge of damage. So more often, both are going to be affected or both are going to be preserved because they're right next to each other, right on midline. Now, this is actually a dorsal view of the system, so that anterior corticospinal tract would be on the other side here. But so I can't exactly point it out. But if you had a hemisection, the likelihood of it hitting exactly on midline and cutting through one side but not the other is pretty rare. But So either you're not really going to be able to tell there's any motor loss in the trunk from that point down, or there's going to be complete motor loss. But the lateral corticospinal tract is very separate at this point. So if you have a hemisection coming in from this side and the other side's intact, then that's going to cut off motor control of the leg on the side where there's damage. You just don't know exactly where the damage occurred. However, making use of the ascending pathways and this sensory discrimination, you can separate out where in the system that damage occurred. So remember, there's a sharp point, which is painful stimulus, and there's a dull point, which is touch stimulus. So we can actually use the two ends of the probe to differentiate between the spinothalamic and the dorsal column systems. Now, keep in mind where things cross over. If I'm poking the leg that cannot move with the sharp end of the probe, while the person can't move their leg, they will feel that painful stimulus. Because the information comes into the spinal cord, and if it's a leg, it's far below where the damage occurred. It'll cross over to the other side and go up the intact side past the damage, the pain stuff, because it's the second order neuron that crosses midline. And for the spinothalamic tract, it crosses immediately at the level that it enters the spinal cord and goes down. However, on the side that they can't move the leg, they will not feel the dull stimulus. Touch crosses over in the medulla. So that information comes into the spinal cord and travels up the spinal cord. On the damaged side, it can't pass over the damage because the white matter's been cut. And nothing gets us to the medulla to cross over for that sensation. On the other side, the leg that they can move, if you give them a painful stimulus, they won't report feeling that. That information goes into the spinal cord on the intact side, but then crosses over, tries to go up the damaged side, and can't get past the damage. So the pain information never gets up to the brain from the side that you can move the muscles on. But if you touch that leg with the dull side, the touch sensation will enter into the spinal cord on the intact side and go all the way up to the medulla before it crosses over. So it will make it up to the brain. So you can use sensory discrimination by touching randomly with the sharp or the dull end of the probe, and you can figure out where that transition is. So at the level where the damage is, you'll see a shift from not being able to feel pain on the movable leg side to being able to feel pain, or not being able to feel touch on the non-movable leg side to being able to feel that. And you can precisely tell where in the spinal cord damage is. The motor information is just going to present with being able to move the legs or not, one leg or the other or not. But with the sensory information, because the information is traveling on either side of the spinal cord, one's going to be affected and the other one's not. And you can use sensory discrimination to tell that. So let me go back to the picture here. So let's say the damage is somewhere about here, but only on half. So if the damage is on this side, it interrupts the dorsal column, but if the damage is on this side, it's missed by the spinothalamic tract. So you can separate out the touch versus the pain stimuli using that probe. And it's the same kind of stimulation discrimination I talked about last time in class, and I demonstrated it for the trigeminal nerve. Here we're talking about somatosensation for the rest of the body, but the trigeminal system is really doing the same thing for the head and neck. This pathway is just for spinal nerve input, but the trigeminal is also coming in, and it has nuclei throughout the brainstem, none of which is depicted here. I think it's the trigeminal nucleus in the medulla that's processing pain and temperature sensations. And I can never remember if it's the pons and the midbrain nucleus that's processing touch and sensation. But those sensations are actually separated out for the head and neck also, just like for the body. It's traveling in slightly different pathways. The trigeminal pathway is going to eventually make its way up to the thalamus and then out to the cortex there also. So, okay. So I just wanted to talk about those spinal cord pathways. The other thing that I might talk about within the context of the spinal cord might be about reflexes, but I think I talked about that last week, right? When I was showing you the motor exam stuff that covered that. So,
Yeah.
Review time.
yeah, so that I think covers everything that I wanted to
Perfect time.
touch here.